Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into what is arguably one of the wildest, most fascinating, and frankly, most consequential stories to ever come out of Silicon Valley. We are exploring the unbelievable true story of a 19-year-old Stanford dropout who promised to completely reinvent modern medicine, and in the process, built a massive, world-famous company on a complete and total lie. It's a story of blind ambition, intense secrecy, and the very real dangers of unchecked optimism. Okay, let's dive right into this. Because to really grasp the sheer scale of this deception, we have to look at its absolute peak. By the year 2014, Theranos was valued at an astonishing $9 billion. Just to put that number into perspective for a second, at that time, this single healthcare startup was worth more than most major airlines and even more than Uber. Its founder was literally being hailed as the next Steve Jobs. She was on magazine covers, she gave a famous TED Talk, and she even leaned hard into that whole persona, wearing a black turtleneck every single day and adopting this deep, deliberate speaking voice. On paper, she was the youngest self-made female billionaire in the country. But beneath all those glossy magazine covers, the billions of dollars in funding, and the high-profile interviews, there was a devastating, closely guarded secret. The revolutionary product that made her a billionaire on paper, well, it never really worked. The entire $9 billion valuation was propped up on a fantasy. So how exactly did a teenager manage to fool the entire world? And why in the world did it take so long for anyone to catch on?
Part 1. The $9 billion promise.
To figure out how so many incredibly smart people were fooled, we have to go back to the original pitch. The story officially kicks off in 2003. A 19-year-old chemical engineering student drops out of Stanford University, a school that, is pretty famous for producing billion-dollar tech dropouts. She leaves with an idea that sounds almost too ambitious to say out loud, and she names her new company Theranos. It's this clever blend of the words therapy and diagnosis, and that name perfectly reflected her ultimate overarching goal. She didn't just want to build a medical device. She wanted to lead a full-blown public health revolution. And you can easily see why investors, the media, and honestly the general public found this pitch so incredibly seductive. I mean, we all know traditional blood testing is, pretty unpleasant, right? It's slow, it requires large vials of blood drawn right from a vein, and then you're stuck waiting days for a lab to process the results. But the Theranos promise? It was the exact opposite. Fast. Just one single prick of the finger, and from that tiny little drop of blood, the company claimed it could run over 200 different medical tests in a matter of minutes and at a fraction of the usual cost. It was the ultimate Silicon Valley disruption applied to a totally outdated medical procedure. Now, what's really interesting here is who exactly was backing this massive promise. Over the next decade, Theranos raised hundreds of millions of dollars without ever publishing their technology in a peer-reviewed medical journal, which, by the way, is highly unusual for a medical device company. But they completely masked that lack of scientific transparency with an incredibly prestigious board of directors. We are talking about former U.S. Secretaries of State, retired military generals, and a former head of the CDC. It was an extraordinary list of names. But notice the expertise areas. This board was largely built to project massive credibility in defense and foreign policy. It was absolutely not a board built with the expertise required to actually evaluate the complex science of blood diagnostics. Part 2. The secret reality. So we've got this glossy exterior, a world-famous board, and that massive $9 billion valuation. But what was actually happening behind closed doors? Well, in 2013, Theranos launched pharmacy testing centers, letting everyday customers just walk in for a finger prick. But behind the scenes, the mechanical deception was absolutely staggering. The company's proprietary, supposedly revolutionary machine was nicknamed the Edison. Theranos claimed the Edison was running all these comprehensive tests on that single drop of blood. But the reality was entirely different. According to later reporting and legal proceedings, the Edison could only reliably run a tiny fraction of the tests they offered. For everything else, Theranos was secretly taking those tiny finger-prick blood samples, diluting them to artificially increase the volume, and then running them on modified, standard commercial lab machines, the exact same machines they claimed to be making obsolete. Now, to keep a secret of that magnitude hidden, the company had to create a severely toxic internal workplace. It was basically like a giant puzzle, where no one was allowed to see all the pieces. Departments were highly siloed. Engineers, lab technicians, and executives were totally isolated from one another, so that almost no one had the full picture of just how badly the technology was failing. The culture demanded strict secrecy with reports of intense internal surveillance, and perhaps most disturbingly, employees who actually tried to raise valid concerns about the safety or accuracy of the tests faced immense pressure to stay quiet, including threats of severe legal intimidation.
Part 3. Exposing the truth. Let's move along and see how this builds, because a secret involving thousands of human medical tests can really only stay hidden for so long. Eventually, rumors and some incredibly brave whistleblowers caught the attention of the press, creating this rapid, undeniable domino effect. It started when a Wall Street Journal investigative reporter, acting on tips from former employees, published a major investigation exposing the massive gap between the public narrative and the internal reality of those labs. Theranos pushed back aggressively, but the floodgates were open. Federal health inspectors swooped in and found severe lab deficiencies that actively threatened patient safety. This prompted their major pharmacy partner to immediately cut ties. And tragically, hundreds of thousands of test results that had already been sent out to patients had to be entirely voided or corrected.
Actually, scratch that. We need to pause on this number for a second. Over 1 million test results were ultimately affected. Just think about that. This wasn't just some glitch in a new smartphone game. These were real blood test results. This massive number represents real people who received completely flawed data regarding their own health. Part 4. The House of Cards collapses. And this brilliantly illustrates just how fast it all fell apart. With the core technology exposed as a fraud and regulators stepping in, the company's finances and leadership structure completely unraveled, leading to some very severe legal consequences. It was a prolonged, dramatic collapse. We go from the founding in 2003 to that staggering $9 billion peak in 2014. But just 1 year later, in 2015, the Wall Street Journal investigation drops. By 2016, regulators forced the lab operations to shut down entirely, banning the founder from operating a lab. The valuation effectively plummets to zero. Board members resign and angry investors file lawsuits. In 2018, the SEC steps in, filing massive fraud charges against the founder and the former president, leading to the company's ultimate dissolution. And finally, culminating in 2022, we see a federal criminal conviction. The criminal trial itself ended up being a fascinating clash of perspectives. On one side, the prosecution's argument was straightforward. They argued that the company's leadership knowingly and deliberately misrepresented the capabilities of their technology to secure hundreds of millions of dollars from investors. The defense, though, took a totally different angle. They argued that failure is not the same thing as fraud, basically saying, hey, Silicon Valley inherently runs on wildly optimistic promises, and simply believing in your own grand vision, even as the science ultimately falls short, isn't necessarily a crime. However, the jury didn't fully buy it. The founder was convicted on multiple counts of investor fraud and conspiracy, and was ultimately sentenced to more than a decade in federal prison.
Part 5. Why this failure matters.
As we wrap up this explainer, it is so vital to look past the sensational headlines and those dramatic courtroom verdicts to really understand the fundamental dangers of faking medical science. So the crucial point here is that real people made real medical decisions based on numbers that, according to regulators, simply could not be trusted. It is so tempting to just file the Theranos story away as another Silicon Valley cautionary tale about fake it till you make it culture. But remember, this wasn't a ride-sharing app that crashed or a food delivery service running out of funding. This was medical diagnostics. This was technology telling a human being whether they might have cancer, whether their thyroid is functioning properly, or whether they are safe to become pregnant. The human cost of adjusting demonstrations to match a sales pitch rather than adjusting the pitch to match the actual science, it's just immeasurable. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. The legacy of Theranos isn't just about one single company that failed. It's about a massive, systemic failure of oversight. Powerful investors, legendary board members, and enthusiastic media outlets all bought into this hype for a full decade. So we really have to ask ourselves, when Silicon Valley optimism meets life-or-death medical science, who actually stops to check if it works? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this gave you a whole new perspective on the true cost of the blood lie.